Hi, everyone. Welcome to our conversation tonight. I'm Robert Jones. I'm the CEO and founder of PRRI. And on behalf of PRRI and Religion News Service, who is co-sponsoring this event, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for what promises to be an engaging and important conversation about two interrelated debates that are roiling evangelicals, Southern Baptists, and in many ways the country. Debates that have centered around two terms: critical race theory and complementarianism. If those terms sound arcane, well, they are. But at the heart of these debates are essentially theological and moral questions about racial and gender equality. I'm way beyond thrilled to be joined by Dr. Kristin Dumay, scholar and author of Jesus and John Wayne, which has just hit the shelves this week as a paperback with a new preface reflecting on the election, and Adelle Banks, an award-winning journalist with RNS. I'll introduce Adelle, who will kick us off and lead us into a discussion of about 45 minutes before we go to Q&A. Please submit questions in the chat to the account label Submit Questions Here. So Adelle, thanks for being with us. Adelle joined the Religion News Service staff in 1995. And since that time, my own writing has been filled with footnotes referencing her stellar reporting. She's now its production editor and national reporter. She reports on topics such as religion and race, the faith of African Americans, and partnerships between government and religious groups. Banks spearheaded RNS's Beyond the Most Segregated Hour project, which won a 2021 Wilbur Award from the Religion Communicators Council, and an RNS project on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, which won a 2014 Wilbur Award. She is a Mount Holyoke College graduate and was previously religion reporter at the Orlando Sentinel and a reporter at the Providence Journal and upstate New York newspapers in Syracuse and Binghamton. So we're in such great hands. Adelle, thanks again for your time, and over to you.
Thank you for asking me to do this. Looking forward to what we'll learn tonight. I'm going to introduce our two main speakers. First, we're going to be hearing from Kristin Dumay. She is a professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. She has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, Religion News Service, and Christianity Today, and has been interviewed on NPR, CBS, and the BBC, among other outlets. Her most recent book is Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Robert P. Jones is the CEO and founder of PRRI and a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He is the author of White Too Long: The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, and The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic Online, NBC Think, and other outlets. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University, an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a BS in computing science and mathematics from Mississippi College. So we're going to get started by not assuming anyone knows the terms in the title of this talk. Thank you. So we're going to go back and forth a bit between those subjects and related subjects. So but we've already started with the Southern Baptist Convention, so we'll continue there. We are a week away from the start of their convention. This is a gathering of a denomination's messengers, as they call it, people representing different congregations in a predominantly white evangelical denomination. And it's been in the news quite a bit lately. and including leaked letters, including one that Religion News Service released related to things that Russell Moore, the ethicist who had long been with the Southern Baptist Convention, raised as he left that job. And he sent it to his now former fellow Southern Baptist leaders. According to one of the letters, he has said that some Southern Baptist leaders have hindered efforts to address claims of sex abuse, as well as work on racial reconciliation. So, Kristin, your book details some recent history of abuse claims made in evangelical circles, including leaders who had to step down from their positions. And there have been survivors of sex abuse and their advocates who have been calling on SBC leaders in particular to do more about sex abuse claims. So I'm wondering what you think about the fact that now the Southern Baptist Executive Committee's chair has said that there should be an independent investigation about the handling of such claims and said that's the right thing to do. So we've reported that just today at Religion News Service. So what does that say about where the SBC is on these matters? And do you think an investigation can be substantive?
Oh, first off, we're going to talk letters, Russell Moore's letter in RNS. I want to start asking you some questions, but I'll refrain. Yes, that really did, shake things up these last few days as both the letter and, what it means. And then the second letter that was issued, revised version of the first. And it sparked enormous conversation in SBC circles and in just wider evangelical circles as well. I think really pinpointing just how systemic the corruption is or appears to be within SBC leadership, the kind of coercive tactics that have been used to silence survivors and to silence their advocates. I think that an investigation is absolutely necessary, but I think you framed the question and what does this mean? And there I'm a little less optimistic, I suppose. I think that their hand was forced in this moment. An investigation is still a very good idea. I'm not sure that simply because we will have an investigation that tells us anything about if any awareness has been raised, if any minds have changed on the inside, because this is not a new issue. That women have for years been approaching the SBC, have been testifying, have been working internally, externally, and there is nothing new here. What we've seen from this letter is just how impressive attempts were to cover this up and to resist dealing with it and to deny that this is a problem. And it really is quite astounding to read Moore's letters. And so does this mean anything will change? I'm not all that optimistic. It would take a dramatic change to undo this kind of culture of abuse and culture of covering up abuse. All that said, the investigation is a very good idea, and I will be watching that with great interest.
Thank
Kristin,
you.
I'd love to hear you say just a little bit more, because you do this so well in your book, about how connecting the dots between the complementarianism like theology and this cover up, right? And
Yes.
the kind of pushback on victims. If I'm right, you've written a lot about this, but both the Houston Chronicle and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram did independent investigations, and I remember the Houston Chronicle piece uncovered something like 700 cases of sexual abuse over a 2-decade period. I mean, this is not a small one-off thing here and there. I mean, this is a sort of systemic. We already have evidence. And that's been out for a couple of years now, right?
Yeah. No, happy to connect some of those dots. So when I first decided to write this book, I had done research on the topic of evangelical masculinity starting more than 15 years ago, and then ended up setting it aside for around a decade. And didn't stop paying attention to many of the men who were promoting this militant masculinity in evangelical spaces. And what I noticed over that ensuing decade is one after another became implicated in scandals, abuse of power, and sex abuse. And so when I decided to write this book, which was in the fall of 2016, one of the first things I did actually was consult with a lawyer, because at that point, these scandals were largely just on the blogosphere, right? So survivors were writing about it, and survivor advocates, and this was pre-Me Too, this was pre-Church Too, this was pre-Houston Chronicle report. And but I knew that needed to be, those stories needed to be part of this book, and they make up the last chapter in Jesus and John Wayne. And the reason why they needed to be part of that story is, it's not just that all complementarians are abusers. Certainly, I don't want to suggest that, but at the heart of this complementarian teaching, these ideas of gender difference, are ideas about masculinity as men are protectors and providers, and real emphasis placed on protector. And so the idea that God has filled men with testosterone so that they can lead, and they have aggression so that they can protect faith, family, and nation, and use violence as necessary. And this applies to their sex drives, right? Testosterone makes them very sexually aggressive at times. And so it's up to women to protect purity, but really that's what you need in a leader. And it's up to women to really prop up the authority of men and to promote that masculine leadership. And so it might sound a little bit abstract. It's not. Open any sex manual, evangelical sex manual for the 1960s or 1970s. This is all in there. If you just look at the writings of CBMW, the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, right? And kind of this think tank of conservative evangelical complementarianism, and the idea of man as protector, of needing to fight and needing to fight in the military and needing to defend. All of that is just baked into this ideology. And so what we see happening then in these cases of sex abuse in evangelical spaces is repeated patterns of the man being the perpetrator, being very quickly forgiven, or victims are very quickly blamed. What did you do to seduce him? Or maybe the wife wasn't properly meeting her husband's sexual needs. So again, blame the woman, blame the victim is very common. And this need to continue to protect the authority of the leader, the patriarch, the masculine authority. And you just see this in repeated patterns where, good evangelicals, good Christians in these communities come around and protect and defend the perpetrator for the sake of protecting his ministry and protecting the witness of the church. And just countless examples of this. And these are the patterns that we observe. And this is certainly what we're seeing inside the SBC at the highest levels, these instincts to downplay it, protect the witness, and protect the masculine leaders, even if they are perpetrators.
Thanks for making those connections. Robbie, I want to ask you about a little bit about the critical race theory, which if that issue came up in a resolution that was passed at the last meeting when they were in person, 2019. And I'm wondering about what you make of the current debate that's kind of brewed over the past 2 years, and whether the debate that's going to happen for sure, whether it will come to some distinct conclusion, or whether there isn't any way to satisfy everyone who has very different views on whether it should be addressed at all and how it should be addressed.
Yeah, well, first I'll say it's remarkable that this debate is happening in the Southern Baptist Convention. So this is the denomination which I grew up. It was the denomination founded in 1845 on the proposition that owning other human beings based on the color of their skin was consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? That is the genesis story of my home denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention. That word Southern is there really to designate their break with their Northern brethren, that preceded the Civil War again in 1845, and then in fact paved the way for the kind of political breaks that resulted in the Confederacy. So it's, I think, remarkable that in 2021, this denomination with this history is kind of taking the stances it's taking. But in 2019, you mentioned they passed this thing called Resolution 9, and that I think for many people thought had kind of settled the issue. That statement said that it actually acknowledged that critical race theory had brought valuable insights, and just had a cautionary note that said, and I'll quote it, critical race theory and intersectionality, that's a kind of connection to gender, should only be employed as analytical tools, subordinate to scripture, not as transcendent ideological framework. So kind of allowing, little cautionary note, but allowing that it's a legitimate analytical tool. And since then we have seen, I think everybody thought that had kind of settled it, and the SBC had maybe kind of threaded the needle here. But what happened in the meantime is that we saw this, for example, last fall. President Trump brought critical race theory into the spotlight and attacked it as part of a left-wing, cultural revolution. Issued a letter instructing federal agencies to end racial sensitivity trainings. And then what's notable is that not right in that wake, we see movements within the Southern Baptist Convention to kind of follow on. So less than 2 months later, the Southern Baptists of Texas, which is the more conservative state convention in Texas, issued a statement saying, on their opposition to critical race theory. And then I've already mentioned the 6 white male Southern Baptists, led by Southern Seminary President Al Mohler, who's up as one of the leading candidates to be elected president of the SBC at this convention, by the way, issued a hardline statement. And here's what they said. We stand together on historic Southern Baptist condemnations of racism in any form. I should just pregnant pause there. And we also declare that affirmation of critical race theory, intersectionality, and any version of critical theory is incompatible with the Baptist faith and message. And so that's led to people like Pastor Dwight McKissick, who's an African-American pastor in Texas, to leave the state convention and to threaten to leave the SBC. And it's notable, like in response to that, I think this really just show you the kind of what the mindset is. In response to that, Southwestern Seminary President Adam Greenway, who was also part of that, one of the signers of that, acknowledged the pain when McKissick spoke up and did say that critical race theory does rightly decry racism and injustice. But he went on to defend the fact, these 6 white male seminary professors just did this without consulting any African-American leaders at all. No pastors, no other leaders in the denomination. And even in retrospect, went on to defend that. And he declared this. He said, human experience neither determines nor falsifies biblical and theological truth, and dismissed the criticism of the exclusion of any African Americans in that statement. Dismissed that as that criticism as part of the critical race theory worldview in itself. So there we are. It really is an epistemological claim, right? That even in a statement about race and racism in the country from a denomination that laid the framework for a theological, that was one of the principal providers of a theological justification for slavery, even for a slave denomination with that history, doesn't think they need to, that they need any additional lights other than their own.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that perspective. Kristin, I want to broaden the idea a little bit, the field of our conversation. You mentioned in your book that there was opposition to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. By some fundamentalist pastors. And I'm wondering how you compare that sentiment to current opposition to critical race theory or to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, I think there are some real similarities there in that, I should say, the similarities I see. So you have in the 60s somebody like Jerry Falwell, right, opposing ministers and marchers, opposing any pastors or religious figures who would engage in politics, by which he meant civil rights. And within a few years, he'd really changed his tune, and then he was obviously one of the architects of the religious right. And so context matters an awful lot. But in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., it's not just fundamentalist pastors who kind of opposed him, but I think he's most interesting for what we can see about kind of more mainstream white evangelical responses, right? Which were guardedly positive, guardedly supportive. Somebody like Billy Graham, emphasis on guardedly, up through 1964, 1965, and after the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. really pulling back from that, kind of the sense that, okay, we've achieved civil rights, we're good now, and pushing for anything more, that's where we're going to back off. That's where we're going to critique, and that's where we're going to start emphasizing law and order, which historically speaking and in its contemporary guise is a deeply racialized concept, right? The law and order meaning the assertion of the authority of law enforcement over against rioters and anti-war activists as well. So to kind of protect the status quo using violence when necessary. And so in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., we can see guarded support until that point. And then when he's calling for more radical economic changes and, saying we have not yet achieved equality, we have more to go, that's when we see a real cooling off. And I think that attitude, it's continued to this day. So the sense of, and Robbie's book makes this very clear that the sense of innocence, the sense of we are on the side of what was right, and this kind of myth making of we supported civil rights, we supported Martin Luther King Jr. Remember, Billy Graham once took the dividers out between the black and white sections at his crusades, and so we're all good here, rather than continuing to listen to the voices of Black civil rights leaders, people like Martin Luther King Jr., or the voices of Black evangelicals or Black Christians in their circles who are calling out and saying there's more to be done. There are systemic injustices. There are, we really need to address these. And here we see a lot of pushback from white evangelicals who claim, that they are, and actually, I think many of them genuinely believe that they are not racist, right? So they have these warm feelings, and they do not feel racist, and yet they support policies and that perpetuate structural racism, and oppose Black Lives Matter, and there's a kind of whole list here that you can see. But that's why the conversation is so fraught, I think, right now, because it's really hard to have this conversation when we're really kind of working with different histories, we're working with different understandings of what race and racism are, how that operates, and so I think we need to have common stories, we need to have common histories, and we need to talk across differences. And that conversation has been very difficult for white evangelicals who, are denying that experience matters when it comes to discerning truth. But of course, in doing so, they are placing their own experience at the center of that discernment process, and then defining truth as they see it and saying that's truth for all.
Robbie, on another topic that relates to race and evangelicals, in the afterword of your paperback version that's coming out soon that I got to take a peek at, your book mentions that the First Baptist Church in Richmond rang its bell, and what its pastor said was a fitting response supporting justice as the monument to Confederate General Stonewall Jackson was removed. You said that was a sign of hope and change, and I wonder why you think that's significant, especially given some of the additional research in your book about Confederates and Christianity. And I'm wondering if you see that as just sort of a one-off, or if there are other signs of hope and change you see on this topic.
Yeah, thanks. So I just got back from Richmond actually last week, and which I hadn't been back. So when I was writing the book, it was 2018 into 2019. I spent a couple of weeks in Richmond doing research, interestingly enough, in the archives of the Daughters of the Confederacy, whose headquarters are there in Richmond. But while I was there in 2019, so Richmond has this long Monument Avenue that proceeds west out of the city, and about every quarter mile there are these big traffic circles, and inside those traffic circles are these massive monuments to the Confederacy. There were 4 major monuments heading out as you head out west, and the full history there, to kind of appreciate the full arc, is that when that subdivision was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And particularly in the 1920s, at least half a dozen churches, white Christian churches, relocated from downtown to replant themselves in the shadow of these monuments, right? That was part of their kind of identity. It's kind of, they wanted to be literally in the shadow. And so the traffic circles are here, and almost every traffic circle with a monument to a Confederate leader is ringed with white Christian churches, right? That were mostly built in the 1920s. And so that's that migration is part of the story. But last summer, as the city was removing, and the one outside of First Baptist is the statue of Stonewall Jackson. And as the city was removing this, the staff decided to ring the bell to kind of signal their approval of the removal of this monument, especially given this history of their church. And the bell, I found, was kind of a nice metaphor, because that when that church was downtown, it's very old, predates the Civil War. That same church offered that same bell to the Confederate Army to be melted down to make cannon. And ultimately, somebody stepped up and basically bought it back, so they didn't have to give it away. So they kept the bell. It made the move from downtown to in the shadow of the monuments, and then that same bell was rung, in celebration of the monument being removed. So obviously these are symbolic. It doesn't solve everything, but I took a kind of bike ride down Monument Avenue just last week, and it is quite remarkable, right? To kind of go down, in every traffic circle now is not a monument to white supremacy anymore. It's empty pedestals, right, where these statues used to be. So in many ways, I think it's a monument to progress and justice that we're seeing there. And I think it's significant that this church that was instrumental in propping up that white supremacist worldview was now willing in 2021 to stake out, a different footprint. Again, doesn't solve everything, but it's palpable. The changes, those monuments stood for 100 years in that same spot. I mean, even 2 years ago, they were all just as they were when they were put up. And within the space of a year, I think really as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, they've all been moved. One other quick caveat, though, I was also really pleased to see there was a Black Lives Matter tent face out, a permanent one that are out there collecting signatures, raising money, immediately facing the only monument that's still there is the one to Robert E. Lee. And that one has been spray painted with Black Lives Matter. It's basically a Black Lives Matter performance art space now. And in fact, it made the cover of National Geographic magazine as a racial justice protest monument now. But when the last statue out there was placed in 1996, and it's a statue of Arthur Ashe, the African-American tennis star who's from Richmond. And just to kind of put, an ambiguous kind of end to this little narrative, as I got off my bike and I was standing there, and it has Hebrews 12 actually posted on the back of we have to have such a great cloud of witnesses, that verse. And Arthur Ashe is holding a tennis racket in one hand and books in the other, standing for education, surrounded by children. That's the bronze part of the monument. And as I was taking a picture of that monument, a white guy in a car passes by me and says, "F that monument," like yells at me as I'm taking a picture. So there we are. Yeah.
Thank you for taking us there to Richmond. That really helps people understand how things have changed there. So Kristin, I want to give you the opportunity to take us to Texas, where something hasn't quite happened yet, but I think it really relates to what you've been writing about. So you've written about muscular Christianity, so-called, and how it's been displayed in all sorts of different ways. And you mentioned the Promise Keepers movement and told a bit about it. And that has addressed both the roles of men in general and race relations in particular. So both topics kind of we're discussing here. Next month, they are planning their first stadium event in quite a while. And you had mentioned that they had sort of kind of disappeared from the scene after being this big movement. I covered them when they were on the National Mall with their big Stand in the Gap event years ago. So now they're going to be in mid-July in Arlington, Texas, in a stadium. So I'm wondering what you think that will look like, given all of these discussions about the topics of complementarianism and critical race theory and other things that relate to both gender and race. What do you think is going to happen there? Do you think there's going to be any change in the message from what they preached years ago?
Yes, significantly. So now I'm thinking I really do need to be there, don't I? Texas Stadium in July, a bunch of Promise Keepers. But no, I anticipate it's going to look extremely different than the Promise Keepers did at the height of their popularity in the 1990s. So Promise Keepers in 1990s, really a mixed bag. It was, you can find a lot of different kind of directions that the movement is pulling in. As I write about in the book, this is the end of the Cold War era. And so so the Cold War had really kind of stabilized these categories and masculine militancy and so on. And then in foreign policy and domestic politics, and that's all up for grabs. And some promise keepers respond with a kind of, upholding patriarchy, but most are trying to soften that. So we have a soft patriarchy instead of warriors. We have tender warriors, and some are advocating egalitarianism or the kind of equal gender roles. It's in this kind of mixed bag that we also find a movement to work towards racial reconciliation. And to the credit of the Promise Keepers movement, they were the only major white evangelical organization that was actively pursuing, right? They were really leading in this effort. They weren't just paying lip service. That said, even in the 1990s, it had its limits. So, it was not a systemic approach by any means to racism or racial injustice. It was very much, it saw race and racism as individual failings, racism. So we needed to have men who are white and Black come together, mutually apologize to each other, and interpersonally kind of work things out. And that would solve a lot of problems, this kind of individualism that's so central to evangelical spirituality and morality in certain cases, particularly with regard to race. But then what we see happening in the 1990s is even that somewhat tepid approach to racial reconciliation, not racial justice, but just racial reconciliation, sparked a backlash, a fairly significant backlash within the movement, so that by the mid-1990s, the organizers are getting a ton of complaints about this emphasis on racial justice. And Bill McCartney actually suggests that it was the organization's work on racial reconciliation that led to the downfall of the movement, right? That now I think there were other factors at play, but it was that stark. So while the organization, while the leadership may have been pursuing this, the rank and file were not on board. A significant minority, if not the majority, were not on board with that. And so I think there are lessons there. At any rate, that's the 1990s version of the Promise Keepers. Also, this kind of, a softer patriarchy, exploring emotions, tenderness, and really getting men to reinvest in their families. So much, and there too, we see a backlash. By the late 90s, we see a number of men within evangelicalism start to decry that, things had just gotten too soft in the trenches. You don't want tenderness. And so we have to man up. We have to really toughen up. We have to, just get rid of this gentleness. And so you see the pendulum kind of swing back to a more rugged masculinity, a more militant masculinity. And then 9/11 happens, and that more militant masculinity really takes hold, and it's just amplified and within evangelicalism and beyond. Now, we are still in that era today, right? We are still in that kind of amplified militant masculinity and militant conception of evangelicalism, at least among many conservative white evangelicals. And the presidency of Barack Obama only exacerbated that, sense of embattlement. Here we have the end of white Christian America, right? So demographic challenges, threats to religious liberty, that many conservatives responded with, right, times are so tough, we need a warrior who will lead the charge. And they found that in Donald Trump. And so this iteration of the Promise Keepers, I should say that in the early 2000s, the Promise Keepers had rebranded to keep in step with this more militant masculinity. And so instead of Stand in the Gap, they had conferences that were Unleash the Warrior, and really did try to get ahead of things, because they were still seen as too soft and too effeminate, really, by the early 2000s. And we are still very much on that trajectory. So the publicity that I've seen around this summer's meeting is, it's very MAGA, very pro-Trump, very militant, and just very, very right-wing. And I did not get a whiff of racial reconciliation, and certainly I'm not racial justice in the publicity that I've seen.
Can I just jump in? I just want to add, just some polling data that kind of just undergirds what you're saying about where white evangelicals are compared to other Americans on some of these issues. So in 2016, we had a question that said, society is better off when men and women stick to the jobs and tasks they're naturally suited for. And nearly 6 in 10 white evangelicals, compared to less than 4 in 10 of Americans overall, agree with that statement. And in 2020, two questions, majority of evangelicals agreed that these days society seems to punish men just for acting like men. Only 38% of the public agrees with that. And a majority, 56% of white evangelicals say that society as a whole has become too soft and feminine. Again, compared to only 39% of Americans. So real differences on these questions. And those questions were all highly correlated with vote choice, both in 2016 and 2020 with support for Trump.
Well, speaking of, I wanted to ask you about the how you compare the most recent president and the current one who have spoken about racial matters. I'm wondering about what you think is sort of next for this administration that we're in now. Robbie, you noted that President Biden was the first to use the term white supremacy in an inaugural address. And Kristin, you've said that President Trump was embraced because in part of this whole Jesus and John Wayne idea amongst the sector of Christianity you've been writing about. So how do each of you see the relatively new administration relating to evangelicals, white evangelicals in particular? And do you see any chance that some of these issues related to race or gender, that there may be some meeting of the minds as religious leaders and political leaders try to work together?
I'll take a stab. There's a lot there. I guess the first thing I would say that I think is so remarkably different is, that for one thing, President Biden has reestablished the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. That is a broad office, and what President Trump had was an Evangelical Advisory Council, right? That had no real official presence, but was just kind of people that he and Paula White had kind of pulled around President Trump, and it was just overtly evangelical. Like he didn't even pretend like it was more broad in the country. And it's worth noting today too that you mentioned the end of white Christian America, but that white evangelicals are in fact declining in the country. So white non-Hispanic evangelicals have gone from just a dozen years ago being 21% of the country. Today they are 14.5%. Of the country, right? So that's been the drop. The Southern Baptist Convention that is meeting next week has lost 2 million members, more than 2 million members since its peak. It was 16 million, now it's down around 14. And it lost, between 2018 and 2019, it lost more members in a single year than it lost in 100 years. So that meeting, at this crossroads of kind of reckoning with racial equality, gender equality, is happening amidst a kind of a trajectory of decline, right? And so I think that's all really worth worth noting, just in terms of like where we are with this conversation.
Kristin, would you add anything?
Yeah, I would say, to keep in mind, obviously, that when we're talking white evangelicals, there is diversity within that movement in terms of, politics. And so we can use these numbers of 81% and 19%, which are kind of handy and hold up over time to remind ourselves that, 19% of white evangelicals did not vote for Trump in 2016 or in 2020. And, it's those evangelicals, I think, that have been somewhat more active in this administration. So when the, administration did not sufficiently lift the refugee resettlement numbers, like evangelicals, presumably many of whom I think I can say with some confidence would have found themselves in the 19% who really care about this issue, were, right up front and, pressuring the administration and with other religious leaders as well and other activists, and were able to achieve some change. And so I see that caught my eye. I would say among conservative evangelicals, I don't see much kind of active collaboration or will to collaborate, to work together. I still see this more as a kind of oppositional relationship. And, evangelicals also, conservative evangelicals, comprise a significant portion of the Republican Party. And you can, look at Republican politics these days as well in terms of, is this, are they looking to work together or really to oppose this administration and to ensure that, through various means that Republicans will once again control Congress and the presidency. And so that's what I would say in terms of conservative white evangelicals, most would be in the oppositional camp, but that's not all white evangelicals, and just to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah. I'll just add one thing to that, because I think it's just worth saying, this is not new for those of us in the field, but it's worth saying because I think people don't know this history. If we ask the question of when and where and why did white evangelicals become Republicans, it takes us right back to this conversation on race, right? That story that Kristin told about Jerry Falwell, right? What changed his mind on that is that he wanted pastors to stay in the pulpit when he was thinking about Black pastors like Martin Luther King Jr. But when what brought him into the streets wasn't civil rights, it was Bob Jones University, who had a policy against interracial dating and was threatening, and the federal government was threatening to revoke their tax exempt status. And it was defending Bob Jones's racist policy that was kind of the beginning of the Christian right movement, and really the exodus of white evangelicals who all used to be Democrats, right, in the early part of the 20th century. White evangelicals in the South, their exodus begins in 1964 and 1965, and following the Civil Rights Acts. That's when they began to shift from being Democrats to Republicans. And by Reagan, they were essentially, we see this roughly 75-25 split, right, that has been really in place since Reagan. I mean, this is not, it's now, nearly half a century of that embeddedness inside the Republican Party, but the propellant, the fuel that moved them from one party to the other was opposition to civil rights. I mean, the historical record's just really clear on that.
And if I could just add to that too, right, there's often a kind of language within evangelical circles or even among critics that evangelicalism has been hijacked by politics, or the Republican Party has somehow corrupted evangelicalism, and that's just not historically accurate, right? That these are evangelicals who helped create the Republican Party and who are doing so around these very issues: opposition to desegregation, and that's just an important piece to get right. This is not a case of misunderstanding or brainwashing or any coercive power. That these are active, white evangelicals have been active agents in this process and in the new political realignments that we are living with today.
Yeah, I mean, it's true today and too. I mean, I mentioned the Southern Baptists became the Southern Baptists in 1845, but the United Methodist Church split the same year, 1845. And those are the two largest evangelical denominations, largest Protestant denominations in the South. And so what do? They actually prefigure political secession, right? So in many ways, they're laying the groundwork for the political secession that leads to the Confederacy. And if you want to know who's standing on the dice as Jefferson Davis is taking his oath of office, it is none other than the first board president of Southern Seminary, Basil Manley Sr., right, who served for the first 10 years as the founding board president of Southern Seminary, the Southern Baptist flagship seminary. So I mean, this is all very hand in glove. Yeah, there's no hijacking here. Yeah. And if there is hijacking, it went the other way.
Yeah.
Before we move to questions, which we hope we'll have some soon from the audience, I wanted to give you both a chance to sort of reflect on your own connections with some of these questions, because you both wrote about growing up in evangelical settings. Kristin was attended a local Christian grade school in Iowa, and Robbie grew up in Mississippi with Baptist preachers as his ancestors. So I'm wondering first on the gender question, because there was a description in Kristin's book about some very distinct activities for young people that were separate on gender lines. And so I'm wondering if both of you could speak to any activities that you might remember for boys or girls, or for young men and young women that you participated in, what you remember and whether you think those activities, looking back now, were beneficial or were not, or a little bit of both.
Oh, good. I get to talk about Calvinettes here to hundreds of people. This is great. Yes, I was a member of Calvinettes. And honestly, it wasn't until I think I was in graduate school that name struck me as anything but natural. So let me step back a minute. I grew up in a Dutch Reformed ethnic community. My dad was a theology professor and ordained minister in the Christian Reformed Church. So I was always kind of on the edges of evangelicalism. I actually grew up identifying over against evangelicalism, right? We were distinctive. We were part of this Reformed confessional community. My mom was an immigrant from the Netherlands. And so we had kind of our own theology of Abraham Kuyper. And so I didn't identify as an evangelical. That said, we had one bookstore in my small town in Iowa. It was a Christian bookstore. That's where I shopped. I only listened to Christian music because that's what good Christians did. And, we listened to Christian radio in the house and so on. And so even though I didn't identify as an evangelical, looking back, I can see how I was deeply influenced by the popular culture of evangelicalism. And I think that was also true of my denomination, even though they might have liked to think of themselves as very distinctive and confessionally rooted. They were also, and I think increasingly over time, I would argue, have been shaped by broader American evangelicalism. So to Calvinettes, the girls' youth group in my church, what Calvinettes did, we did Bible studies, and we learned how to put on makeup. And we had Mary Kay ladies who would visit us and give us free samples, hoping that we would buy more. We made a lot of crafts. And we did not do the Pinewood Derby. That was for the boys, the cadets. And that made me mad over and over again because that looked to be really fun. And one year, my parents supported me in allowing me to enter a car in the cadets Pinewood Derby race. And so I designed the car on my own. I painted it pink to make a statement, and I was allowed to race, but I wasn't allowed to win. And so that's my childhood experience. It was really not until I got to graduate school, where I went to graduate school to the University of Notre Dame to study religious and intellectual history. I had never studied gender. I never even had a female professor. And I got to graduate school. My first semester there, read my first book in the history of gender and gender and race in colonial America. And I was hooked immediately that week. I changed my focus and became a historian of gender and religion. And it's you can see I haven't really turned back since then. So that's my little childhood story.
Thank you very much, Robbie. Can you compete with that?
Probably not. But I did grow up, very much inside the Southern Baptist world. I mean, I was that kid who was at church like 5 days a week. All through my teenage years, I was in the youth group. And I mean, really, if we were honest, Friday and Saturday were Sabbath days from church, right? Rather than having one day that was a Sabbath from everything else because we were there so often. But like early on, I mean, we had similar, essentially the cadet thing, right, is militaristic even in itself. But I think our version of that, which all these are kind of church versions of the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts, and was it was interesting. But you can read it in the names here too, right? The boys were royal ambassadors, right? What were the girls? They were girls in action. But the action usually consisted of these kind of more domestically oriented kinds of activities while we went on camping trips and did the Pinewood Derby. Yep, ripped off from the Boy Scouts. So that all sounds pretty familiar, even though, but I think the thing that stands out for me is, so I grew up going to public school in Jackson, Mississippi, and ones who've heard me knows that this has kind of stayed so with me is that I actually was in elementary school in the mid 1970s, and that's how long it took for our public schools to actually get integrated. And so I remember the first African American kids showing up at my school, and so this is a major event, right? We were on a working class side of town. It was a white working class side of town, very segregated. So up until that point, no black kids in our neighborhood, and all of a sudden we have these African American kids showing up, and our church was utterly silent about it. Didn't march and resist it, but was just gave us absolutely no tools for understanding this transformation that was happening, right, with us in our public and our social lives. Absolutely no tools for that. And I went to a high school that changed their name in the 1950s as a result of Brown v. Board of Education to be the Forest Hill Rebels, right? And we were like Ole Miss. We had which by the way is a reference to the plantation, the lead woman on a plantation. That we had a Colonel Reb as a mascot. We flew Confederate flags at the football games. The band played Dixie when the football team. And this was a public high school that was 50-50 white and black integrated, right? And absolutely no critical thought, nothing, right? Kind of helping us think about that at all. Even in my college years, I went to Mississippi College right outside of Jackson. Who's our mascot? Choctaws, right? And would chant "Scalp 'em, Choctaw, scalp 'em," right at the football games. It was a kind of regular chant at our little white Baptist college. And just none of this, right? Did I get any critical distance on or help? Thinking. And so the thing that's really the first time I read Letter from Birmingham Jail, I just stared at it because there was this line that said, like, where King is kind of, he's in Birmingham, he's in jail, and he's just kind of thinking in dismay, and he's writing to the moderate leaders, not the kind of rabid racists. He's writing to the so-called racial moderates there, and he has this line where he says, who are these white Christians sitting safely behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows? And I just, now we didn't have stained glass windows because we were working class Baptists, but the metaphor still works. Because I feel like that's the work that the Christian faith I inherited did on me, is that it really prevented me from having any sense of racial justice and any tools really to think that way, right? And as you were saying, Kristin, like, as long as I wasn't personally racist, that's kind of the end of the story, right? There was nothing else really to think about on this front, no matter what kind of injustice and inequality I saw outside the window. And so I really think that piece is what has really stayed with me. And it really is the book is really a journey of my trying to come to terms, with that blindness that got instilled in me by my faith.
Thank you both for being willing to share a bit of the personal side here. And it is time for us to move to the questions of those who are watching. So I'm going to start with the first one for Dr. Dumay. I've been discussing Jesus and John Wayne with a friend who is a religious historian, and he expressed a concern that defining who is a real evangelical culturally instead of theologically would make evangelicals of some folks who clearly aren't from any sort of theological parameter, and it would exclude many others who clearly are. How would you respond to that concern?
Oh, good. We get to talk definitions of evangelicalism. So, I've written quite a bit on this in other spaces as well, in that there are multiple ways of defining evangelicalism. I actually have a piece out there called, there are no real evangelicals, only imagined ones. And so I think that first off, all scholars need to acknowledge that that's what we're doing, right? We are defining evangelicalism in particular ways so that we can address particular questions, and that's going to allow us to ask some questions and to answer them and not others. And so you can define evangelicalism if you want as a theological rubric. And that's what many evangelical leaders want to do. And that's what some historians of evangelicalism, particularly those who are evangelicals themselves, would like to do. So you have a theological rubric, say the Bebington Quadrilateral. This is on the website of the National Association of Evangelicals. So this 4-part, right? Authority, upholding the authority of the scriptures. You have crucicentrism, or the centrality of the cross, conversionism, or the born again experience, and then evangelism, or activism, acting out of those beliefs. And now, if you use that to define evangelicalism, what you're going to see is you will find evangelicals the world over, right? The majority of global Protestants will be evangelicals. You will also find that the majority of Black Protestants in the United States fit those, can check off those boxes. So is that the real way to define evangelicalism? The problem is the vast majority of Black Protestants who can check off those boxes do not identify as evangelical, right? And that is something that we should take seriously. That is a clue that there's more to evangelical than simply checking off those boxes. In fact, when you go back to those boxes and you look at the authority of the scriptures, well, which scriptures are we talking about? Which passages are really looked to as a guide for faith and life in white evangelicalism and in Black Protestantism? You're going to see some very real differences. Christocentrism, what does Christ look like in white evangelical spaces and in Black Protestant spaces? Let's talk about activism, right? Acting out of your faith. You're going to see diametrically opposed in many cases what that looks like. So for me as a cultural historian, right, I want to see evangelicalism as a historical and cultural movement, right? And what I end up doing is defining it in terms of alliances, right? We need to see, who's connected to whom, who's going to church with whom. There we see also a lot of a pretty wide split between, white evangelicals and Black Protestants, but also parachurch organizations, and particularly I introduced the idea of understanding evangelicalism also as a consumer culture, right? And so you can have, I already talked about my own experience of, not identifying initially as an evangelical, not really knowing that was a thing. It just wasn't relevant to me. Many evangelicals, by the way, don't really identify as evangelicals. They see themselves simply as Christian, kind of default category. And so this evangelical popular culture ends up forming people spiritually, forming people religiously. Many evangelicals are tuned in hours and hours every week to Christian radio. They're reading Christian news magazines, right? They're deeply shaped. They're studying in small groups, week after week, products from the Christian publishing houses. And that's what I'm trying to talk about. So people who self-identify as evangelicals, I take that very seriously. People who are self-identifying as evangelicals, because increasingly they are self-identifying into this current iteration of evangelicalism, which is predominantly white, predominantly conservative, and so on. And again, people are identifying out of evangelicalism as well. So if you want to say, nope, here's a different way of defining evangelicalism, I would say, okay, just define your terms, acknowledge that that's what you're doing, and understand that you're going to run up against some limitations. And what I try to do in Jesus and John Wayne is I identify the limitations of that traditional kind of intellectual history, theological approach to evangelicalism, and instead just look at it as how it presents itself in history as a historical and cultural movement. And that's what I'm describing. And it comes in pretty handy too that, much of the survey data is in fact reflecting this self-identified evangelicals are born again. And so those are really the people that I'm talking about here.
Thank you, Robbie. There's a question that would be good for you. Move on because we're.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Can you talk about how you understand Christian nationalism as a political movement in relation to the topics you're discussing? How does this movement relate to the SBC and other white evangelical entities?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the first thing I would say is I would be really careful with my terms and say that when we're really talking about white Christian nationalism. This is really an ethno-religious movement. It's really not just a Christian movement. So I think it's most accurate to call it a white Christian nationalist movement. And when I wrote the end of White Christian America, I think I kind of provocatively titled the book that way because this term, like white Christian America, right, I think is at the heart of a lot of our most visceral debates today. And that it's worth remembering that movements like the KKK, for example, weren't just about white supremacy. They were about white Protestant supremacy in this country, right? So they were anti-Catholic, they were anti-Jewish. It was an ethno-religious white Protestant America that they were protecting, essentially. And that sense of things is still very much here. And I'd say like that's what's at the heart of this white Christian nationalist movement is the idea that to be truly American, one needs to be white and Christian, right? That's who owns the country. That's who God intends to inherit the country. There's a whole historical movement, kind of America's the new Zion and all of that is that justifies, atrocities against Native American peoples, that justifies slavery. And it is this kind of idea, right, that white Christian people are coming to take possession of the land, like read right out of the Hebrew text. so I think that it's a serious, it's a serious threat that we're seeing, in the country, and it's wrapped up also in a lot of conspiracy theories that are flying around. We just did a survey that we just released a couple of weeks ago that showed, for example, that believers in QAnon, which we defined, not only as kind of having these, wild sensibilities that the country is being taken over by a group of pedophile, sex people who are trafficking children in sex, but also these kind of apocalyptic ideas, right? That the end of the world, that there's a storm coming that's going to sweep away people in power and restore the rightful leaders very soon, and a proclivity to violence, right? That things are so in disarray that that patriots are going to need to take up arms and commit acts of violence in order to set things right. And we find that shockingly, more than a quarter of white evangelicals, and again, these are self-identified white evangelicals, believe that all three of those statements to be true, right? So not just kind of that these conspiratorial forces are out there, but that they are going to be called on to pick up arms and violently overthrow the government. I mean, we saw that in January 6th, some hints of that, and worth noting that, right, those weren't just QAnon and Proud Boys, but I mean, mixed in with all of that was the Christian flag, all kinds of Bibles, Bible verses, Christian symbols, big crosses, being erected. I mean, it was all mixed together. And so I think it's something that, is not as fringe and crazy as it sounds. I mean, it's something that we really have to take seriously. If it's a quarter of white evangelicals and a quarter of Republicans that are believing these things, all right? And as Kristin said, I mean, white evangelicals make up about a third of the Republican base. So it's a very significant movement. So I think it's something that has not nearly gotten enough attention. And I'll shout out to Taking America Back for God and Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead's work, which has been really critical in helping us understand that as well.
All right, we have a question about Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. So Kristin, why don't you take a first stab at it? What about conservative evangelicals appealing to Martin Luther King Jr.'s memory to use against the BLM movement, the Black Lives Matter movement? Can we consider it a continuation of the use of Dr. King by the religious right under Reagan's presidency?
Yeah, I think it's very much in line with how we've seen Martin Luther King and his legacy domesticated and softened and de-radicalized and really put to the uses of the very white moderates that he was calling out. So he's really being co-opted to offer a sign of, good enough, right? We've done this and it was great. And see, we supported that, even though they didn't back then. But just how quickly his memory has become co-opted so that it's now sanitized and it's now become part of this myth, part of the American myth and part of the American evangelical myth, right? That we are the good guys, we being, kind of white evangelicals are the good guys, and we supported civil rights and we supported this one, again, even though they largely didn't, certainly not to the extent that he would have liked. And therefore, this is the way to do it, and not the way that Black activists are currently calling for, not in the way that addresses these structural inequalities, that addresses economic inequalities, not in the way that Martin Luther King Jr. himself was calling for. And so I think we do see kind of consistency here, and almost a kind of weaponizing of his memory to disempower activists today, but while maintaining their own innocence, their own self-identity as not only are we not racist, but we really support this civil rights activist who is dead and who is, really mythologized.
Robbie, thank you. Robbie, there's a related question concerning criticism against quote unquote radical claims by Martin Luther King Jr. What differences do you see between white evangelicals and Black evangelicals opposing CRT? And I'd add whether there may be some on either side of the race question who may be supporting CRT. I just wonder whether you've noticed any racial dynamics in how people approach CRT within evangelicalism, Blacks versus whites.
Well, I think we can to be really concrete, that resolution 9 that got passed inside the SBC would not have gotten passed without real pressure by African American members and pastors to kind of tell them to back off, because I think there was a real push to make a strong-throated, complete condemnation of critical race theory, and I think the presence of African American pastors saying, "Hold on, we're going to need to kind of think this through, and we're not going to get behind that and support it," was the reason why you got this measured statement, a couple in 2019. It's remarkable, though, to me too, speaking of King, that the way that many white evangelical leaders, and not just white evangelicals, but in many of the bills that are showing up in education bills that are showing up all over the country, condemning critical race theory and prohibiting it from being taught in public schools, for example, would in fact have the effect of a school honoring Martin Luther King Day because it's on the state calendar and prohibiting the teachings of his actual teachings in their public schools. We could actually end up there, right? Because if you read Letter from Birmingham Jail, it's an indictment, right? It is an indictment of white moderate Christians in this country. There's no way to read that, in a way that doesn't say it is doing exactly what kind of the scholarship in critical race theory is doing, and that is asking white people, and particularly white men, to affirm something as simple as that they don't stand in for everybody, right? And that experience matters, as we said, and that listening to Black voices and their Christian witness is part of what it means to be a faithful white Christian, right? And it's a denial of that. It's an outright denial of that on the part of critical race theory. So I think the real chilling effect is that it would mean that Douglas, Thurman, Cone, King, all those people are who have given such gifts, I think, to the Christian church of helping us have a broader understanding of the gospel, a broader understanding of sin, a broader understanding of repentance, are going to be screened out, by definition, from not only syllabi, but church Bible studies.
If I could just quick add to that too, right? What you're saying is you don't need critical race theory to get to where just plain old U.S. history brings us, right? And that's what's so astounding about what's happening. You already talked about critical race theory is started in legal profession. It's a set of analytical tools. It's an epistemology in many ways. You don't actually need that. You can just study American history, and church history too. Exactly, right? You will get to the same place. You read these primary sources, you read the secondary sources. And so what is so chilling is just having watched in real time over the last 3 or 4 years, how CRT gets elevated to this, this dire threat in churches, in the nation, in the Republican Party at least, and how is going, the intention is not to address some epistemological theory. The intention is to really keep us from studying our history. And to me, that is deeply, deeply concerning.
Right. Well, we have a final question that's a good big picture question to end on. Where do we go from here? Clearly, sexism and racism are significant problems for and among white evangelicals. Beyond unpacking and explaining why, where does this research lead you and us?
I'm feeling really discouraged tonight. So, we were supposed to leave on some sort of hope. And I think we both tried valiantly in our books to find some hope. I don't know, it's mixed. When I came to the end of my writing, I really didn't have much hope, so much so that my editor had to come to me last minute and say, Kristin, this book is really depressing and you can't leave your readers here. You just can't. And so, I looked at it all and I went back to him and I said, sorry, I'm depressed too, but this is where I am. It's so deeply entrenched, right? And he said, okay, I respect that. And then 2 days later, he came back and said, Kristin, just give us something. And so that's when I gave him the last sentence of the book, which is what was once done might also be undone. And honestly, at the time, it felt almost absurd. It felt ridiculously feeble. But it is true, right? It is true. And that's why, knowing our history is so critical. And that's why I'm so concerned about these movements to, abolish CRT and to, reach into schools and colleges, and what counts as CRT, just basically, US history. Because if you know this history, if you really know this history, so many white evangelicals, what I've found in terms of the reception of Jesus and John Wayne, this book has been so disruptive in conservative evangelical circles, precisely because so many evangelicals have been kept from this history. It wasn't in the histories that they read. It wasn't in the histories that their schools taught them. If they went to Christian schools, certainly not in most homeschool curriculum. And so many are flabbergasted. And once they see this, they realize things have not always been as they are now. And they realize that, change might be possible. They can see what needs to be changed. And so, that said, change is really difficult, especially when the status quo is so deeply entrenched and the powers are so formative. And so what I'm seeing right now, I have a lot of hope when I see individual change. I see, this evangelical reckoning that somebody like Ed Stetzer has talked about. It's real and it runs deep on an individual basis. When we're looking at institutions in white evangelicalism, I'm seeing very little movement. I'm seeing often further entrenchment. And so, so where are we now? It's very hard to say. When I look at individuals, I can see real reason to hope. And then when I look at the broader movement and I look at institutions, I end up being discouraged again.
Robbie, did you have anything to add about this?
Yeah, no, I think Chris and I are calibrated pretty closely here. And I think it may be because we've not only studied this world, but we've lived within it. And we just know how deep down to the bone these things are. And realistically, I think, we have to say, we're looking at 400 years of things that we're really trying to undo, right? And those knots don't get untied in a single generation. So I really do think this is multi-generational work that we're talking about here. And the one thing I would say that I think, the first chapter of the book I titled Seeing, S-E-E-I-N-G, because I really think that's the biggest challenge. Kristin's work as a historian is all about unearthing, helping people see the history better, differently, more clearly. I think that's really the moment we're at, and I'm finding some hope. Like I think that the experience around the Tulsa Race Massacre, just that we've just passed the 100th anniversary, I think it helps. I think that event both gives me some hope, because I think the fact that we had wall-to-wall national media coverage, we had a sitting president of the United States fly to Tulsa, say this was not a race riot, this was a massacre, right? Talked about white supremacy. All of that, and that the churches of Tulsa actually confessed their roles in blaming the violence on the African American community and papering it over with Christian platitudes, right? And in fact, the biggest thing that was said from white pulpits the Sunday after the massacre was that what we need here is not less Jim Crow, but more law and order. That was basically the message coming from white Christian pulpits the Sunday after that Sunday after nearly 300 people, maybe even more than that, had been killed by their white neighbors in Tulsa. But we had a president come down and mark this event. I think that's really significant. And yet at the same time, there's a amazing speech by the former mayor of Tulsa that was made 2 days after the massacre, where he pledges that every penny that had been taken from the Black community in Greenwood would be repaid down to the last penny, he says. And 100 years later, not one of those pennies has dropped. So I think that's where we are, right? We're at a place where we're trying to acknowledge the past, and I think we don't know what to do with it. But I at least find some hope in the people I've talked to on the ground, churches that are white churches particularly, that are actually trying to wrestle with this history and trying to learn this history. That's going to bring us to a place of acknowledgement, a place of confession, and then if you're a Christian, confession certainly isn't the last step in the process, right? It goes to repentance and repair. And so I think that's going to be the next pages of work, the next steps of work to do, is to kind of move from confession to repentance and repair.
Thank you. I want to remind everyone who's listening that we have 2 books for you to consider. You have Robbie Jones' White Too Long, and you have Kristin Dumay's Jesus and John Wayne. And they are both available right now in hardcover, so you don't have to wait to consider looking at them. But paperbacks are just out or about to be out. Kristin's is out already, and just this week, and it has new reflections. And Robbie's will be out July 13th, is it, Robbie?
Yes.
And that will have a new afterword. So they both are a little different than the original versions. And finally, we'd also like to invite you to all join us for another engaging conversation between Kristin and Robbie on July 1st at 7 p.m. Eastern, which will be hosted again by PRRI. It is held just ahead of Independence Day, and the theme of that conversation will be what to white Christians is the 4th of July. And Kristin and Robbie will reflect on the rise of white Christian nationalism and its threat to American democracy. So once again, we want to say thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your good questions and your attentiveness. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening.